Hi, this is a lecture on deterrence and rational choice, and I have thrown in another theory called routine activities, and just for your pleasure. Let's start and look at kind of a little history. Um, in the Enlightenment period, philosophers talked about the social contract, and this was kind of a hypothetical idea that there had to be some things that existed to establish the rules of a society. And so the idea was that as a society forms, people give up certain liberties or certain free will actions in order to be protected by the group or the government. And these ultimately, um, the ideas of harm then become the boundaries of society, which we call law. So the idea of a social contract really is that law is formed through consensus based on what the majority want. Now, deterrence theory really comes from what's called a classical perspective, and they believe three things: man or woman is a rational being, and how they define rational is really kind of a static definition that apparently we all have the same rationality, that people possess free will. In other words, they can choose what their destiny is, and because they can choose, then they ultimately choose between right and wrong. And so, one of the first philosophers who really kind of wrote on the idea of deterrence was Caesar Beccaria. And he was an Italian philosopher and wrote a book using a different name about the Italian system because it was so subjective, that there were 200 capital offenses. People, they weren't written down. It was basically up to the judge. You could pay the judge off. In other words, he really kind of is the father of what I'll call due process. But some of the things that he believed were in this basic premise of the social contract, and from kind of a utilitarian perspective, where you're doing the best for the most people in society. And he believed in order to have a rational society, you must respect and support the right of the state to punish. And therefore, criminals, based on this social contract, ultimately answer to the government, unlike some of the other nations where the divine authority was either God or whoever they believed in, or it was a sovereign ruler like a king. So he ultimately then kind of laid out some ideas, that the fundamental requirement is that laws and legal procedures really have a process. And so they should promote and preserve the social contract, and they should promote happiness, security of the society, and then they should promote the prosperities for their members. And when we get down a little bit and get to Bentham, this becomes incorporated into the theory of utilitarianism. And so ultimately, here's some things. They had secret accusations. So how could you defend yourself if somebody accuses you of something, but um, you can't state your side or face your accuser? So Beccaria wrote this book called On Crimes and Punishments. And he said that the only reason that you do have criminal law in legitimate punishment is for deterrence. You actually have a goal that you're trying to deter their behavior so they don't do it again. And so, in order to do that, you have to have reasonable penalties that people are encouraged to obey. There should be equal treatment and due process for all. It shouldn't be based on how much money you have. The system should be rational, fair, and efficient, and penalties should be proportionate to the crime. And so he believed that we should get rid of torture and the death penalty. After Beccaria came Jeremy Bentham, and I had to include this picture. Here's Bentham. Bentham's will required him to be basically stuffed like you would a deer and placed in a box, and he gave a large sum of money to the University College in London, and so the will had required him to be present at all the board of directors meetings. So that actually is Bentham's body stuffed. That is not his head. That's a reincarnation because, as you can see, uh, on this was what his head looked like. And so they put it in a separate glass container, and then the students would steal the head. So now they have the head locked up and they put a wax head on the body. But here's a picture. They're having a board of directors meeting. There's stuffed Bentham sitting at the meeting. Kind of gives you an idea of where his ego was at. But Bentham is really called the father of utilitarianism and the classical perspective. And he came up with what he referred to as the principles of utility and believed that people were governed by pursuit of pleasure and that they would avoid pain. So therefore, you would want your society to give the majority pleasure. And so you do the greatest good for the greatest number is one of the key phrases. So the criminal law should focus on the gravity of the offense measured by the injury or harm done to society. In other words, if two people fight and one is injured, the injury is now not against the person, but against the society as a whole. And so he did believe punishment is an evil and should be used to exclude some greater evil. And so these are some interesting things that in modern day law we tend to forget. These are cases that he said we should not use punishment. And one was where no mischief for it to prevent. So if you do something, for example, you could even put somebody that grows a marijuana plant in their backyard and smokes it in a state where marijuana is illegal. The mischief there, it's all contained within the person. They're not selling it to somebody, you know. So what are you trying to prevent? And ultimately, uh, you could say, well, there is some mischief, but how far do we go to enact that? Because no one else was hurt. Where the number two is where it cannot act to prevent mischief. And three, where it would be too expensive or where it would produce more mischief than it would prevent. And this is one of the things I really think we have to look at our systems today because many times through probation or even parole that you'll have somebody that does something minor, but because of technicalities based on the contract they sign with probation or parole, they have violations that they keep going back to jail for that ultimately ends up being so much more time than the crimes were. For example, I had a young man who stole a stick of beef jerky, and at the time they were 79 cents. And when he was intoxicated and high at the same time, kind of pushed the clerk out of the way as he walked out, didn't pay for it. He got originally charged with assault, which got reduced down because basically the woman wasn't hurt, she was just pushed. And he got charged with theft by unlawful taking. But he had a drug addiction, and that kind of combined with mental health. And so he had some problems following through on his contract. And the original sentence really was 11 and a half to 23 months with 5 years probation. And by the time he got done with his sentence, when we talk about just raw jail time or prison time, he was incarcerated over 5 years for 79 cents of beef jerky, and that included an extradition. So that's way, way more expensive than that 79 cents of beef jerky. Finally, Bentham said, where if left alone, the mischief may cease itself. So some kids, like might do some, you know, pranks when they're juveniles that they ultimately aren't going to do when they're adults. So do you really go after somebody just because they did something that ultimately would go away? So Bentham also believed that the punishment system should reflect rational thought. And we're back to what is considered rational. In order to do this, Bentham lays out the theory of deterrence. The tenets are that there has to be a certainty that the person's going to be caught. Celerity is swiftness, that they're going to be punished swiftly, and severity, which he believed was the least important thing, should be just a little more pain than the pleasure they got from the crime. So when you think about crimes and you think about sentences, sometimes our sentences don't match the severity or the lack of severity of the crime. There are two types usually that we refer to of deterrence. Specific is where it is the offender themselves. So you're trying to deter that specific offender through a punishment so that they say, this isn't worth it. I did now, it canceled out my pleasure, and I'm not going to do it again. General deterrence is for would-be offenders, that they look at what happened to the specific offender and they say, oh, gee, I don't want what happened to him happen to me. So one thing that is in Bentham's work that a lot of times that we don't talk about, but we will in class, is proportionality. And that is that the punishment should be proportional to the harm caused by society. So take the example that I gave just a minute ago about someone growing a marijuana plant and then smoking it. What harm have they caused to society? So should it even be a crime? And you could probably do that with a lot of the what are classified as illegal drugs. Punishment must be severe enough to overcome the pleasure. Well, on some crimes, how do you determine how much pleasure the person actually has from what they've done to, actually calculating the severity of that? Um, and finally, law should provide a penalty which does not vary based on offender characteristics or circumstances. And this is really kind of what we would refer to as determinate sentencing, that you have one sentence that fits all. But one of the problems with a determinate sentence is it doesn't take into different offender characteristics. So there might be different set of circumstances that we look at that might change that proportionality. Now, rational choice is really an updated version of deterrence. And it's more, it really comes from roots of economic theory. And instead of weighing pain versus pleasure, now we're weighing the costs versus the benefits. And so there's 6 assumptions in rational choice theory. Crimes have a purpose and they are deliberate. The risks and uncertainty affect decisions so that there is limited rationality. People don't think they're going to get caught, so there's some uncertainty of whether or not they're going to get caught. Decision making, how much they put into the decision making depends on the crime. Some crimes require much more decision making. For example, you take a pedophile and how they would have to have steps in order to groom a suspect in order to do their crime compared to somebody that just goes into a store and shoplifts. There is a difference that they assume in involvement decisions, versus committing the actual act, which they call event decisions. So um, sometimes people, the involvement decisions could be that pre-planning. But committing the act, there could be things happen at the event that are not calculated for that then result in something different. For example, you decide you're going into 7-Eleven and for a robbery and you're going to pretend you have a gun, but the person doesn't believe you have a gun and you're just using your finger. So you end up hitting that person, which was not intended originally. Involvement, then they have broken down into initiation, habituation, and desistance. And why does somebody get involved? Why do they stay in it? And what makes them desist? Those are each different. And then ultimately, event decisions include sequences of choices. Well, in life they do, but what ultimately dominates those decisions really comes back to why do people commit the crimes. Here's some problems with deterrence and rational choice theory that have been brought up. First, the offender must be aware of the penalty. So if I know, like I'm going to go shoplift a lipstick, I have to kind of know what the penalty is so that I can say, well, that's not going to be pleasurable. And even today, other than people in criminal justice, most people have no clue what the penalty is for certain crimes. Two, I must be fearful of the consequences. That has to be the pain. And so when you have proportions of society who are rotating in and out of jail all the time, it becomes part of life. It doesn't really become too much of that pain that they were looking for. The benefit has to be immediate and usually is if I'm committing a crime. But the pain ultimately is going to happen in the future. So think about how long I get caught burglarizing. And then how long is it going to take before I get my punishment? There's going to be a gap. So they're really not connected. And that's why in deterrence, they wanted swiftness. It was basically like you would certainly get caught, then you would swiftly be punished so that everything was matched up. Deterrence also relies on formal sanctions, in other words, the criminal justice system to mediate behavior. But all the research to date shows that that doesn't really change behavior. It's much more the informal sanctions that people weigh as being more important. So, for example, I have a job and um, people at work respect me. I don't want to get a DUI and go to jail and have them know about that. So because of that, then I don't drive drunk. So if I don't have a job, actually some of the research shows that people that are unemployed, they don't have the same concerns that somebody that's employed or is a pillar of the community. So one of the big things that I have added is that they assume that rationality is static and that everybody looks at it the same. And think of yourself, what you consider rational is really based on your upbringing and your environment and what you've been told and those outside sources. So if I'm upper class, I'm going to be told one thing compared to lower class. Does that mean that my rationality is less because I have a different set of beliefs? Something to think about. Routine activities theory, you probably went over when you were an undergraduate, and this is the idea that we look at crime from a different perspective, that you have three things that are needed in order for a crime to be committed: motivated offenders, suitable targets, and the absence of capable guardians to guard the targets. And so the main proposition coming from routine activities is if you change one element, it would affect the crime rate. And under routine activities, it really was target hardening. And so For example, a suitable target is your house when you're not home. And so if people go to work, how do we protect the house? Well, today you might have a dog that might protect the house. Many people have security systems like the Ring um, to watch it, so that there now is something that is hardening that target, even though the capable guardians are missing. And so that might make offenders less motivated. Just something kind of cute. I always like that one. Kind of plain and simple, but kind of works. So Ray Paternoster was the one that did kind of a analysis of the deterrence research, and the expectation is that get tough policies where we had longer sentences, hot spots. Remember, 3 strikes you're out. The whole goal of get tough policies was that they believed that we were being too lenient. So if we got tough, crime rate would go down based on we would punish people harder and then they would learn their lesson and wouldn't offend in the future. But we've done, 20 years of get tough and found out that it really had a weak deterrent effect. Um, in some spots it did show, but overall, the psychological literature shows punishment really does not eliminate behavior. And we can get into this down the line, particularly when we start talking about rehabilitation, that we have to target what makes them act criminally. Um, some other thing is that the system isn't that swiftness or celerity friendly. The one person I had, it took 4.5 years for her to go to court. So that's not very swift. Punishment still remains uncertain. Does the offender get caught? Do they get arrested? Do they get convicted? And ultimately, do they get sentenced? So that's a big question mark. So when you're dealing with offenders, most people don't start out, hey, I'm going to get caught. They're thinking they're not going to get caught. The other thing that shows is that one thing is that new police strategies and adding more police does have a small um, deterrent effect because you're increasing certainty. But the newer research shows it can fade over time. One of the reasons is what we call displacement, that, that you have police in one area, the crime kind of moves out of that area to the next area. Ultimately, there's little evidence to support that there is a correlation between perception, what an offender thinks their chance of getting caught, and deterrence is. And we do know that less experienced offenders perceive a greater risk, which is a smart thing. But once they start getting away with it, then the idea of risk goes down. Perceptions aren't strongly related to actual levels of punishment. So most people, again, going back to the assumption, they don't really know what sentence they're going to get. And overall, they found that offenders really don't weigh the costs and benefits because they really concentrate on the benefits. So in other words, most people don't think, okay, well, what's the negative thing going to happen to me? They think about what's the positive thing. So, and that is a brief lecture on deterrence.